The next question I want to ask is, it seems that somebody mapped the world during the meltdown of the last ice age. Did these people also have a religion? And interestingly enough, the Piri-Reis map turns out to be centered on Giza. It's quite a sophisticated azimuthal equidistant projection. There's a tremendous sense of connection between sky and ground at Giza, and it is indeed as though 3 stars have been brought down to Earth. And speaking of stars, we shouldn't then be surprised to find that the Great Pyramid of Giza is aligned to true north, south, east, and west with stunning accuracy. The error off true north is just 3/60ths of a single degree. This astonishing precision in a prehistoric monument on this gigantic scale. It is a precision that we could achieve today, but any architect would ask the client, okay, you want to build a 6 million ton monument, but really, are you sure you want it aligned to within 3/60ths of a degree of true north? Because if you want that, then it's just going to cost you a whole lot more to make it. Very, very difficult thing to do. We can make you a big, fantastic monument, but please don't make us align it perfectly to true north. In fact, the alignment is so precise that we can be sure that the people who made it were familiar with navigation, that these are navigational levels of precision in the alignment. And also, there are hints of much greater antiquity at Giza than is allowed to the site by Orthodox Egyptologists. Egyptologists prefer not to believe anything that the ancient Egyptians said. It's a strange thing. They almost seem to despise the culture they're studying. If ancient Egyptians ever say anything which conflicts with Egyptological dogma, the Egyptologists say, the ancient Egyptians were wrong about that. We're the ones who are right. So the Egyptologists dismiss this scene, for example, in the temple of Seti I in Abydos, where Seti I shows his young son, the famous Ramesses II, a list of all the pharaohs who'd ruled in Egypt before their time. Now, the interesting thing is that that list doesn't stop at around 3000 BC when Egyptologists say that the first dynasty began. It continues back beyond that, tens of thousands of years. It actually goes back more than 30,000 years before the time of Ramesses II. Right back to what the ancient Egyptians call Zep Tepi, the first time. If we go to the Temple of Horus at Edfu, itself a relatively late construction, but built on just the latest recension of a series of temples that go back into the dawn of time, we will find carved on its walls a massive body of texts. And these are called the Edfu building texts. And the Edfu building texts do indeed speak of a gigantic flood that destroyed the homeland of the primeval ones, of the gods. And that the survivors of this flood came to Egypt and made it the place where they would restart their civilization. And the first thing they did was they established mounds called primeval mounds all over Egypt, which were to be the sites of all future temples and pyramids. Of course, Egypt today we're looking at a culture that has 3,000 years of known history, from 3000 BC to around the time of Christ, and monuments within that period are all built around and on top of one another. It's an incredible mix-up, but some of the monuments that are attributed to the historic period, like this one, the Osirion, very near that temple of Seti I in Abydos, but 50 feet lower, had to be excavated from under the ground, I do strongly feel have been wrongly dated, and that these gigantic megalithic structures belong to an earlier period of construction in Egypt, indeed to the time of the gods. And here are just another view of this amazing Osirion that we find at Abydos. And of course, I won't go into detail in the work of John Anthony West and Robert Schoch on the geology of the Sphinx, but they really did stir things up back in the early 1990s when they showed that precipitation-induced weathering weathering caused by exposure to thousands of years of heavy rainfall, is the only thing that can account for this very distinctive style of weathering in the trench that surrounds the Sphinx, and originally on the body of the Sphinx too, but it's been constantly restored. Indeed, the Sphinx was being restored, and we have historical records to prove this, in the time of Pharaoh Khafre, who is supposed to have built the Sphinx. So if he built it, how come it was also being restored during his reign? The suggestion is that the Sphinx stood on the Giza Plateau during a long period of heavy rainfall. And such rains have never fallen in Egypt since 3000 BC. You have to go back to the Neolithic subpluvial, the end of the Ice Age, 10,000 years ago or more, to find the kind of rains in Egypt that could have caused this distinctive weathering pattern. So the three pyramids of Giza dominate the skyline of modern Cairo. And as we come closer, we see the Giza Plateau, we see the village of Nazlet al-Saman, which lies around the base of the Giza Plateau. We're looking now at the north faces of the three pyramids. Over here is the Nile Valley. Off to the west, the desert extends endlessly into the distance. Let's come closer now to the Great Pyramid. This is the entrance complex, the original entrance here, and the entrance forced by the Caliph Mamun in the 9th century. Closer still, you can see that the Great Pyramid is not complete, that there's a flat platform on the top of it with about half a course of masonry on the south side here. And closer still, Graham Hancock, a much younger man, standing on top of the Great Pyramid in roughly 1996. That was one of 5 climbs of the Great Pyramid that I was privileged to make, 3 of which were illegal and 2 of which were legal. The legal climb, you have to pull a lot of strings, then you have to sign a piece of paper at the bottom of the pyramid which says that in the event of your death, your heirs will not hold the government of Egypt responsible. But actually, the illegal climbs are much more fun. Well, it's an amazing thing. The statistics are here for all of us to read. It's got a footprint of 13 acres. It's 481 feet high. It weighs 6 million tons. There were once 115,000 shaped casing blocks that went all around it, each weighing 10 tons each, but were knocked off during an earthquake in the early 14th century. And the angle of slope, by the way, this is the corner to climb, the southwest corner. That's the safest one to go up. The angle of slope is 52 degrees. I want to take you around the Great Pyramid, be inside it for a while, and we'll start down here in the subterranean chamber, which in fact lies 100 feet vertically beneath the base of the Great Pyramid, and is approached through this descending corridor, somewhat more than 300 feet long, which slopes down at an angle of 26 degrees to reach the subterranean chamber that is carved out of solid bedrock. And this is what the subterranean chamber looks like. And the Egyptological view is that the pharaoh Khufu initially planned to be buried here, but for some reason, after he'd got his workforce to create a perfectly straight 300-foot-long tunnel, removing all of the bedrock from there and bringing it outside, that somehow when all of that had done and they'd started to cut the subterranean chamber, the guy just changed his mind and said, "No, I don't want to be buried there after all. I want to be buried higher up." I think that the subterranean chamber, like everything in the Great Pyramid, has a very specific purpose. It looks exactly the way it looks because that's how the builders wanted it to look. And I think it's also deeply ancient and prehistoric. It's a fact that if you stand down here and have a colleague with a good singing voice sing in the king's chamber hundreds of feet above you, you can hear that person very, very clearly, quite spooky. So this is the descending corridor that comes down to it, cut out of solid bedrock, 350 feet long, almost perfectly straight, hardly any deviation at all. from top to bottom, just fractions of an inch, and sloping at 26 degrees. So then we'll come up here, we'll come up the ascending corridor, we'll go along the horizontal corridor, and we'll find ourselves in the so-called Queen's Chamber. So-called because nobody knows what the function of this chamber was. Now, it has two famous little shafts in its south and north walls. If you'd come here before 1872, you would not have seen a shaft there because the last 5 inches of stone covering the shaft had been left in place by the builders. You'd have just seen a closed wall, but a British Freemason called Wayneman Dixon went around tapping on the walls of the Queen's Chamber, found these two hollow points, knocked away the 5 inches of stone, and found that it led into a shaft ascending up into the body of the pyramid, and a similar one on the north side of the Queen's Chamber. A German robotics engineer back in 1993 explored the southern shaft of the Queen's Chamber. He sent up the little robot with a camera attached to it, because these shafts are only about that wide and that high. No human being is going to get in there. And 165 feet up the shaft, the robot came to this door with two metal handles blocking the shaft. And at that point, Rudolf Gantenbrink's work was abruptly stopped by our friend Zahi Hawass, and Rudolf was expelled from Egypt, and no further work was done for many years. Zahi took over the project, and he commissioned the University of Singapore to make another robot, and that robot was designed to drill a hole through the door and find out what was on the other side of it. What they found on the other side of the door was a gap of about 3 feet and then another door. They're now trying to figure out how to get through that one and see perhaps if there's a chamber on the other side of that. Coming back out of the Queen's Chamber, we'll go up the Grand Gallery, this amazing and majestic cavity within the Great Pyramid with a corbel vault, blocks of stone weighing 50 to 60 tons each, perfectly positioned, sloped at an angle of 26 degrees. You cannot get a thin sheet of paper into the joints between the blocks. Here's the King's Chamber itself. It's an incredible geometrical construction. It consists of granite blocks, 100 granite blocks, all of which was brought from Aswan, 500 miles to the south. The rest of the pyramid is limestone. You can see one of those shafts in the northern wall there. The sarcophagus in it, which is the only reason really for anybody to conclude that this was a tomb. Of course, it was not a tomb, and a sarcophagus may have another function altogether. That ceiling has got 9 50-ton granite blocks in it. There's an interesting similarity between what's called the Djed pillar, a symbol of the resurrection of Osiris, and the design of this chamber system. And if we go into the chamber system, go right up to the top chamber, we can see lots more graffiti from 1915 there. Sister M.J. Martin, 6th of February 1915. And over on this wall, that's my daughter Layla, by the way. We were up there filming. That's one of those 50-ton granite blocks that she's sitting on. Up on this wall, there's lots more modern graffiti, but there's also some ancient graffiti. And that's the other reason, the only basis that Egyptologists have to attribute this monument to Khufu, is that up there in that hidden chamber is this piece of graffiti which more or less says the name Khufu in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. There is a really strong case to be made that that graffiti is forged, and that it was forged by Howard Vyse himself. It contains a grammatical error that was only present in Egyptology textbooks from that period. There are, however, and it's important to stress this, there is ancient graffiti in that chamber that's genuine, which disappears back between the joints, in joints between the blocks. If you shine powerful lights in there, you can see that this strange writing goes far back to a point where no forger could ever reach. But this area, in plain view, I believe it's highly likely that it was forged by Howard Vyse, who was desperate for a discovery, and he was able then to declare, I have found and proved that this is the Pyramid of Khufu. He got a lot of money for that. But this is the only statue of Khufu that's survived. It's about that high. He clearly was not a man with a giant ego. He did not inscribe his name anywhere else within the Great Pyramid. And obviously, This is a problem.